This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to the special edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenawalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. We're on location today at Millersville University in my Canadian government class, where we're going to hear from internationally renowned folk singer Garnet Rogers.
As you know, we've talked about in class, Garnet, I think, is the premier folk singer, not just in Canada, but in all of North America. He has been learning his trade and been immersed in music for well over 50 years. Through the influence of his brother Stan, through the influence of his uncles, and listening the Grand Ole Opry in the radio, in his in his bedroom with his brother while he was growing up. He learned a lot about music, and we find that he developed into, as I said, I think the greatest folk singer in all of North America. I guess we'd like to start out just because there are many of my students here who've never had the opportunity to talk to a Canadian.
Bonjour. I just want to say from the outset, I can see the disbelief on some of your faces. Partly, I'm here to, to acquiesce to your professor's request, but also I think I'm mostly here as a object lesson as to how not to conduct your life. Stay in school, study hard, stay away from whiskey. Leave the guitar in its case, and you'll have a chance at not ending up like this. And the other thing is you're doing Canadian studies, and there's a town in Saskatchewan called Swift Current. You'll probably find that on your map that you have to fill out at some point. Just so you know, the town motto is there, "Welcome to Swift Current," where the citizens are neither. So that's always just useful information. And the idea of being a well-known or a preeminent folk singer is a contradiction in terms. So it's more like being with the Witness Protection Program. So I just want to make that clear. So now I'll let your professor continue. Sorry.
That's quite all right. The only joke I had last night introducing Garnet was that I said from the beginning, we've been working and trying to attract him for over 3 years. And I said I've been optimistic throughout this whole process. But then one of my friends who was a musician who performed in the first act last night, he told me that the true definition of an optimist is a folk singer with a mortgage. And I had not known that before, and I didn't know if Garnet had a mortgage or not. It turns out that he doesn't, but he paid his, I'm sure. Garnet, could you tell us, what does Canada mean to you? How would Canadians talk about the essence of their own country?
Actually, there's another folk singer who I think is the preeminent folk singer in Canada, Bruce Cockburn, and he defines Canada as being the country that he hates least to live in. We are somewhat more liberal, we like to think of ourselves as being a more kinder, gentler nation. That's not really the face we've been presenting to the world over the last 8 years. We've had a very conservative prime minister, but we like to think of ourselves as just a kind of a self-effacing, not very dangerous bunch of people who we try to be polite to the rest of the world. There's a great piece of footage from the last Winter Olympics where our women's hockey team beat your hockey team, and not to make too much of a point about that, but they actually had a microphone as the two teams were gliding by each other and shaking hands, and the Canadian team were all saying, "Sorry, sorry, sorry, sorry." That's pretty much the essence of Canada. Once in a while we actually do win, but we feel bad about it. So
Well,
I don't know if that helps you or not.
yes, it does. How other than listening to music on the radio with Stan, how did your music career begin? How did you become interested in music? Was it all through Stan or through your uncle?
No, we grew up together. I mean, he was older than me by a few years, but we had the same influences. We grew up listening to the same stuff, and it was all American music. It was music that came up initially from Wheeling, West Virginia. There was a big radio station there. We got to listen to live country music from the deepest heart of American roots and country music. That's all we had to listen to. Then back in the early days of the folk revival in the late 50s, we began again listening to American folk music. We were listening to people like Leadbelly and Odetta and Woody Guthrie, all these sort of icons of Pete Seeger, people who they weren't just writing songs for the commercial market. They had actually come out of hard times. Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee and the Carter Family, these songs that we were hearing weren't written for the radio. They were written because they had to be written. They were people documenting their lives. Lives were ruined, relationships foundered, families were broken apart, the economy went to hell. People had to travel to California to try to find work, and to find out that there were 5 million other people there who were also looking for work, throughout the 30s. These were songs that had grit to them. There was nothing about pop music in these songs, and they all had 3 chords, and they were easy to learn. And that was a big part of it. You didn't have to attend school to learn. If you were going to learn to play, a Schoenberg 12-tone scale. That was a whole other thing in classical music. It was easily accessible. One of the signal moments for both my brother and I was about 1965. It was around the time Bob Dylan was huge. He was part of this enormous folk revival, and he was writing his own songs that sounded like they were already old. He was using old forms of music to make his songs have a kind of an immediate feel of authority. And he was the darling of the folk world, and they all took him as their prophet, as their spokesperson. And he had the audacity and the temerity to want to move on past that. So he discovered electric guitars, and he started working with electric musicians. And you may have heard rumors of there was a riot at the Newport Folk Festival when he took the Paul Butterfield Blues Band on stage with him. They played 3 songs, a riot erupted, and all. Anyway, my brother and I was in grade 3, and my parents, who were big folk fans, took my brother and me to go see Bob Dylan. And he came out and he did an hour's worth of all the good stuff, the acoustic stuff. And then there was a little break, and then he came out with these 5 guys wearing sharkskin suits and Ray-Bans, who later became the band. And they had amplifiers, they had drums, and according to the script that the media had written for the whole event and for that whole tour, the place just went completely crazy. This riot erupted, and there were literally 3,000 people at Massey Hall in Toronto tearing up seats, throwing them at the stage, screaming false prophet. The whole place was going crazy. And there were police out front, there were ambulances, people were beating each other up in the lobby, they were screaming. I mean, I'm not exaggerating this one bit. It was the most extraordinary thing I'd ever seen in my life. Just the effect that this electric music had on this group of people who, up until 15 minutes before, had been worshiping this guy. And there were literally people being carried out on stretchers, and there were police horses inside the lobby of Massey Hall, pooping on everything. I mean, you couldn't have gotten more chaotic. And I'm standing there in grade 3, and I'm holding on to my dad's hand, and I'm looking around and going, "This is great!" That was the moment I thought, I'm going to be a musician. And I was already playing guitar. I was already learning how to play guitar and ukulele and some other stuff. But that was the moment. I didn't want to be the object of that stupidity, which is what it was. I was witnessing stupidity. People wanting someone to remain constant and static within what they were doing. All Bob Dylan wanted to do was move on with his art and create something different, and which is what art is. You want to keep evolving. They didn't want him to keep evolving, but I wanted to be part of that hurricane. I wanted to be somewhere in the midst of that storm, and I didn't want to have these nitwits, looking at me so closely. But that was the moment I decided I was going to be a musician, and that was grade 3, and I have never deviated from that ever since, and it's all I've ever done, which is I basically played guitar, played violin, got drunk, and beat up people. That was my whole job.
Well, we've been looking at Canadian music and Canadian folk music. How would you define Canadian folk music, Glenn?
I think mostly people see it as it's partly deeply personal. It's partly shaped by the land, the enormous sweep of land that you have in Canada. I've been touring as a full-time musician since 1974. And making a living at it since about 1988. That's just the way it went. But it's perfectly within reality for me to drive for 4 days to get to my first show. And just get in the car and I drive to Jasper, Alberta, and that's 48 hours of driving, and that's the first show, and then you're on the road for a month. So you have this huge expanse of land that's in between. The cities are just completely incidental to this immense landscape, and I think there's a real sense of loneliness and isolation that is kind of the back story. It's the undercurrent to a lot of the songwriting within Canadian folk music. There's also I think a secondary theme of just whining about how we're always perceived as being secondary to the United States. And that's just us.
Is there a process that you go through in songwriting? How do you go about writing your songs?
I have no particular means of working. Sometimes I will. I imagine there are a few of you here who probably keep a journal, some kind of diary. It's a useful occupation, particularly if you're, I've been treated for clinical depression for most of my life, and I basically have to keep a journal of just to see what part of my crazy cycle I'm in. And so they'll have something to deal with when I finally arrive by ambulance at the. Oh, look at that! Last week, oh dear. A journal is a good thing to keep, and you write down what you after a while, after you've been writing songs for a bit, you get into a habit, if you're a good little songwriter, of just you come up with a line, or you think of something. You're looking at the sunset, and you think, oh, look at that! It's a phrase comes into your head. You write it down. You're not going to remember it later. Write it down. You might do that for a couple of months. Then you look at, you flip through the pages and you go, oh, I guess this is what I was thinking about. Looks like a song to me. And then you just basically collate the whole thing and edit it. And that's how it happens sometimes. Sometimes it just pops into your head full blown. I've had a number of songs where I'd be out running, and the song would arrive like just divine dictation, and I'd have to bang a left turn and run back to my car and get into the car and scribble this thing down, and then I'd continue my run. Sometimes I'll have words kicking around or a tune kicking around for 10 or 15 years before it finally coalesces into a song. And I think one of our greatest writers, Leonard Cohen, who is a font of information and wisdom about the writing process. He said two things as pieces of advice towards budding musicians and songwriters. He said, first of all, never make an important decision when you need to pee. The other one was that songwriting is a terrible and humiliating process, and it will break your heart. But in the end, every song will. There's no song that won't finally relent if you just keep working at it long enough, and that's part of what I have to adhere to. I've got one song. I had the verses of it for 10 years. I started writing it in Montana. I just had these verses, but I had no chorus, and it needed something else to break the song up. It was just a song about missing my wife. And I was sort of doing my annual dunging out of my Volvo. I was pulling out all the empty coffee cups and used fast food wrappers and stuff that had accumulated under the seats and everywhere. And I was pulling all this junk out of the car and just sort of, throwing it into a bag, and I found an envelope. And the envelope contained a letter that was informing me that a friend of mine had died, someone I actually didn't know personally, but we'd been corresponding during the length of his fight against leukemia. And I thought, oh God, there's that letter from Smithers, BC, and so this was the letter from his sister saying that my brother has died, and he sent his best wishes, kind of thing. And anyway, I turned the envelope over, and on the back there was this scribble in my own hand, and I'd obviously read the letter, put the letter back in, and I have no memory of doing it, but I wrote, we are brief as summer lightning, we are swift as swallows' flight, we are sparks that spiral upward in the darkness in the night. We are frost upon a window, we won't pass this way again, in the end only love remains. And I thought, oh, there's the chorus. So I stuffed that in my pocket, and that's, so 10, 15 years later, that song was done, and that's all it took. So the short answer is I haven't the faintest idea. I have no idea what I'm doing. It's just random.
We'll have more from Garnet Rogers after this. Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, helping hospitals provide healing, health, and hope to communities across the state. And by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions to make the commonwealth more competitive, creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Express, transporting construction, farm, and industrial equipment throughout the United States, and by Blackford Ventures, LLC, a private equity firm seeking to make significant investments in real estate, proven business enterprises, and their leaders. Find out more at www.blackfordventures.com. And by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
As musicians in current times anyway, we're taught to be extremely well-rounded. My question is, do you dabble in other genres of music, jazz or maybe classical every now and then or something like that?
And not just music. I think all disciplines are good. I actually thought I was going to be a painter at first. When I was a teenager, I had my easel set up, and I had a swivel chair, and I'd be working on a painting, and that would come to a grinding halt. And I could just turn to 180 degrees, and I had a 4-track tape recorder, and a couple of microphones set up, and I had my guitar, my violin, and my flute, and I'd lay down a song, and then I'd start doing overdubs with it, and I'd turn around and work on the painting a bit more. And it was just I needed an alternative to dating, and that's what it, because there was nothing going on, believe me. Anything that you can possibly find that's going to stretch your imagination or the boundaries of your taste or even your credulity, just say, well, I can't believe someone's trying to pass that off as music. Really. So it's the more you can possibly listen to, because you're young. They did a study recently. I saw it on the internet, so it has to be true. But basically, we stop listening to new music after age 30. You stick with what you most wanted to hear when you were of a certain age. When you know, from the time when you're 15 and, you know, hormones completely take over your body, every single waking thought you have is you know, this out of control thing that's from here down, that you're, you know, you're trying to deal with. But the music that you're listening to at the time is it's going to be imprinted in your DNA. And when you think of, like, you know, the experiences that you have as a young person are so incredibly intense. And I can remember every second of my life on the road, you know, as a young person, you know, in spite of the fact that I was drinking about a bottle and a half of scotch a day. I can remember everything with precise detail because it was so intense. And that intensity will lessen as you get older, and you'll get more blasé about things. But you do stop listening for new stuff after a while, and you need to listen to as much of a broad spectrum of music and see as much, and listen to as many differing points of view and expose yourself to as much stimulus as you possibly can, because after a while you're not gonna give a damn. It's like, I've never heard a Taylor Swift song in my life. I have no interest. I'm sorry. I never bothered. Not likely to.
Following up on that question, do you find any value in any of the contemporary, like any of the current music trends right now, such as electronic music and hip hop? Like, do you find anything that's worth, the musicalities there?
I mean, I'm starting to hear a little bit of it now. I have to say, when I first started listening to hip hop as a form of folk music about 25 years ago, when it first started coming out of the islands, out of Jamaica, and like dub music, dub poetry, and I was interested in that. When hip hop became sort of more urbanized and became as much of a lifestyle, as an expression of a lifestyle, and culture as it did, and I still saw it as folk music, and certainly a really extraordinary expression of anger about say urban youth, that's I suppose white shorthand for black people, young black people living in inner cities, but the kind of anger and frustration that is within, you listen to NWA or any of those early bands. There was so much extraordinary anger there, and I thought that was really worth listening to. It was important.
There is still that current of music going along, and people do still make a music that's not just to make money, it's just for people to enjoy within that genre.
Well, yeah, and that to me is the most exciting thing that you hear. And getting back to this early experience I had with Bob Dylan, it took me a long time, a lot of years, to process what happened to me that night. There was all this nonsense going on in the press. Well, Dylan sold out. Well, he did 18 months on the road with that band, and there were death threats against him. Al Cooper, the keyboard player, quit the band because he was afraid of the death threats. He thought he was going to get shot on stage. The drummer left, was replaced by Levon Helm. But they toured that act all over North America and into England and Sweden and everywhere else. And every night the same damn thing happened. Everyone just stood up, started throwing stuff at them, screaming false prophet, Judas, all the rest of this nonsense. There's lots of recordings you can hear. And what is commercial about that? What is selling out about that? He's doing this thing against public disapprobation of they hated it. But as I came to understand it later, this experience when I was in grade 3 watching Dylan, this was the most important thing I'd ever heard. This was a person speaking the truth, and he didn't give a damn what other people thought. He was saying what he wanted to say. He didn't care what they thought. If you want to listen, fine, listen. If you don't want to listen, well, maybe just shut up and go away. But and there's a story about Beethoven where he was given a commission to write a violin sonata. I think it was the Kreutzer Sonata, and this famous violinist came to him and said, Maestro, I'll pay you so much. Would you write this piece of music for me? Fine. 6 weeks later, Beethoven let him know, commission is finished. I need my money. Guy comes in, hands him the money, takes the manuscript away. He's back 3 days later, and he said, Maestro, this is an extraordinary piece of music. It's wonderful, and thank you so much. Just one thing, you've written notes that don't even exist. They're impossible to play on the violin. And Beethoven just, I guess he started throwing things out. He says, I don't care about your damn violin. I don't care about your fiddle. And that was fantastic. It was someone speaking the truth. It's the same way when I first heard Jimi Hendrix. No one had ever heard a guitar sound like that before. That had never existed. And I remember the exact moment I heard Jimi Hendrix for the first time. My best friend's older sister was putting this record on the turntable, and she was just putting the needle down, and I just happened to wander over because she was wearing a low-cut blouse, and I thought I might be able to get a look down the, oh, come on, I was 14 years old. and I wandered over, and 20 minutes later, I'm standing there, and I got this drool hanging out of my mouth. She's left the room long since, and I had never heard anything like it. This guy was making this sound, and he didn't care whether you were wanting to listen or not. This was his sound. The first time I ever heard Kurt Cobain, I'm just sort of switching through the radio, and they had a couple of albums out before Smells Like Teen Spirit, but I heard the pain in that voice. I heard this extraordinary pain and cry from the heart. I thought, I don't know who this is, but this guy is telling me the truth. I don't even know what I still to the day don't know what the lyrics are to Smells Like Teen Spirit, but I know the Weird Al Yankovic parody of the lyrics better than that. But this was whatever he was saying, it was the truth, and he didn't give a damn whether you were interested or not. He was going to say that. He was going to do it.
On that note, will you join me in thanking Garnet for thank you on behalf of the class, on behalf of Millersville.
Study hard, kids. Stay away from drugs.